There are three narratives of struggle that all end bad. And I think this is where managers can get into trouble. The first narrative is that we struggle against, meaning everything is a battle. It's us against management. It's us against the world. It's win or lose. But there's also another narrative, which is struggle instead of, which is, I'll cover for you. I got this. Here's what you need to do. I'll figure this out, which is the rescuer narrative. And then there's a third narrative, which is struggle alone. How many of us are carrying burdens emotionally, and we tell ourselves, nobody would understand, or they have enough of their own burdens. I don't need to burden them with mine. Every one of those is dysfunctional narratives, but there's a fourth narrative that you're just helping me put the pieces together, which is the narrative of compassion. The fourth narrative is when the going gets tough, we struggle together, not alone, not instead of, and not against. We struggle together.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Conflict at work routinely manifests as drama. Dr. Nate Regier knows that conflict may be unavoidable, but argues that it can be transformed into productive energy instead of escalating into something destructive. Through his pioneering concept of compassionate accountability, Dr. Regier has taught dozens of organizations how to harness conflict as a catalyst for constructive growth and positive change. Nate's an author, keynote speaker, and the founder and CEO of Next Element, which is a global leadership consulting and training firm that's helped clients like Healthcare Corporation of America, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and Roche for over a decade, increasing profitability through reduced turnover while significantly enhancing teamwork and work relationships. In this episode, Nate and I talk about defining and addressing conflict productively, how to de-dramatize an organization, and the universal principles we can use to design effective work. We also discuss the three roles in every drama, their perspectives, how to have a compassionate mindset in the workplace, and the three narratives of struggle that can get management in trouble, and other topics. All right, if you enjoy Work for Humans, please be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, my conversation with Dr. Nate Regier. Nate Regier, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you so much, Dart. It is a pleasure to be here with you and your listeners.
Spent a lot of time over the last week with two of your books, Compassionate Accountability and Conflict Without Casualties. And I would like to rename Compassionate Accountability, and I would like it to be called the No Drama Handbook, which is, it's so much about the source and nature of drama at work and sort of the positive feedback loops that generate drama. And your models are completely new to me. And so I want to go through these different models and I want to understand how they work, and I want to understand, and I think my listeners want to understand how you would go about de-dramatizing an organization. So first of all, when you talk about conflict without casualties, what's conflict? Your definition's a little different from mine.
Yeah, it's important that we do have definitions, and I'm a big believer that definitions should be behavioral and they should be working definitions that give us some idea about what does this look like in practice. So our definition of conflict is it's the gap between what we want and what we're experiencing at any given point in time. And this definition doesn't make conflict good or bad. What it does is it positions conflict as energy in the gap between some things. So that's our basic definition of conflict.
And I see conflict. I see that definition of conflict in my interviews with people about their work. Because sometimes people will say, you know what I want from work? I want to fix some part of the world. They're essentially saying there's something that's out of place in the world and I want to get it into place. And that could be something about climate. It could be anything. So that kind of conflict is not necessarily interpersonal. But a lot of the conflict that you talk about is interpersonal. It's the kind that's actually going to generate emotions and hard feelings. And so you speak a lot about something called Karpman's triangle. What is the origin of that, and what are the components of it?
I love Cartman's Triangle, and it's been around for a long time, since the 70s, actually. Dr. Stephen Cartman was a psychiatrist who specialized in working with groups and families, often in a lot of conflict, drama. And he was fascinated by the interpersonal dynamics about how we get sideways with each other in these situations. But he was also a huge fan of basketball. And he lives in San Francisco. He loved to go to basketball games, all levels, pro, high school, college, whatever. And he was fascinated by how does an offense score on a defense? And he studied it and studied it. I've actually seen some of his notebooks where he scrawled all of his diagrams and notes and images about what he saw. But what he finally discovered was what is now called the triangle offense, which is a particular relationship between three players of the five on the court that becomes predictable. And just when the defense thinks they know how those three people are going to relate to one another, they change the rules. They switch it up. A fourth person or a fifth person gets involved, or one of the three switches their role. And it leaves the defense temporarily off guard and vulnerable, and you score. So he thought, what if this could apply to human dynamics? And what he realized is, indeed, there are three roles that people play in drama. And these three roles he labeled the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. And these are based on the behaviors that they play, not who they are as people, but the way in which they act. And this forms a triangle because a triangle, it's one of the strongest geometric shapes in the world. Bridges, cranes, everything's built out of triangles because they're so resistant to change. Every angle is equal. Every role needs the other role in order to function and find kind of their justification in this dysfunctional, messy relationship. So then we go on to explain kind of what are the dynamics of each of those three roles and how do they play off of each other.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned in there is that these are roles, not necessarily this person's always a persecutor, this person's always a victim. It's a role that they play in a particular relationship. The second thing that was mentioned there is that these are also roles that each of us carries in our heads. All three of them are going in our thought processes. So before we get into that, let's talk about what each of these roles entails. And then we'll talk about how they play together inside our minds.
So each of the roles starts with a belief about myself and others. The victim starts, the dysfunctional belief is I'm not okay, everyone else is okay. And that makes it okay for me to be mistreated. So I don't set boundaries, I don't stick up for myself. I let people take advantage of me because I believe that I'm not okay. And there are, all levels of subtlety with how that behavior gets manifested, but that's the victim role. The persecutor role is just the opposite. They adopt the belief, I'm okay, everybody else isn't, because they're stupid, they're lazy, it's their fault, whatever. And so because they're not okay, then it makes it okay. It's justifiable for me to mistreat them. And so you can already see how the victim and the persecutor, their belief systems match perfectly to complement each other's behaviors with nobody ever calling out what's happening. But there's a third role, which is the role of the rescuer. And the rescuer appoints themselves the savior of everybody else's troubles. So they adopt the belief, I'm okay, and all of y'all would be okay if you just let me fix you and just take my advice and do what I say. In French, actually, the word rescuer is translated into savior, except with a small s. But they believe it's with a big S. The ego, the need to be helpful and stoke the ego. So the victim plays off the persecutor to feel justified in their belief that they're not okay. The victim also plays off the rescuer in their belief that they're broken and they need help and they can't do it themselves. The rescuer plays off the victim because they have someone to save, and then the persecutor plays off the victim because they have someone to attack. And it all works great. And the craziness about it is if sometimes when people don't get satisfaction from their role, they switch, and they switch roles. Have you ever seen someone that maybe tried to help you and you resisted the help, so then they went persecutor on you? It's like, fine, don't take my help. See if I come help you again next time. You can just get an F on your test, And so we see people switching, and that's kind of when we leave people exposed and really start to see the power of the drama triangle to manipulate relationships and people.
Definitely, I've seen that in relationships where there's a couple and they are having conflict and a third person comes in and says, you know, and both of them attack the person who came in as the savior.
And nature hates a vacuum. So all three roles need each other. So I really saw this play out first when I was doing therapy and work in, addictions treatment and recovery, is that every role needs the other role. And if somebody tries to get out of the triangle and change the way they behave, everyone around them hates that because now nobody can feel justified. And they're just trying to draw that person back into the triangle so they can keep playing the games.
How do these play out inside us as the three parts in us?
I might not do justice to Cartman's model. He's actually written unbelievable, incredible stuff about this, and I would recommend people go look up his work. But if you think about there's an external role and there's internal. So we may externalize victim behavior, but what Cartman says is behind every role is an entire triangle inside our heads. So we're all having these voices inside our head. On any given day, let's say that I'm trying to make a big decision as CEO. One voice inside my head says, look, you just need to tell them the right thing to do. They don't understand. That's the rescuer. But then there's the voice that maybe came from a person from my past, a teacher or coach saying, you don't really know what you're talking about. You haven't been doing this long enough. You're a fraud. But then maybe the victim says, yeah, maybe you're right. I should just keep quiet. I don't have any business acting like I know what's going on. So all three voices are fighting inside my head, and they all come from our upbringing, our beliefs, our role models, our personality, and they conspire inside, and we have to reconcile those.
And so one of the things I can see where this is going to lead is that a part of what we want to do to disrupt the drama cycle is to bring, well, I wanted to say bring one of them forward, but none of them is great. So I'm going to hold off on that. Let's hold off on that. We'll get to it.
Yeah.
What are the myths that each of the players in this triangle holds?
Yeah, great question. And these myths that I'll share with you were originally discovered and named by Dr. Taby Kaler. He's a renowned behavioral psychologist that developed the process communication model. And there are 4 myths that perpetuate drama. In other words, they're false beliefs we have about our own worth and other people's worth that allow us to continue to play these roles and justify the roles. 2 of the myths have to do with our belief that we can make other people feel a certain way. So one myth is, I can make you feel good emotionally. In other words, if I do things for you, if I open the door for you, if I whatever, then you're going to feel good. I made that happen, so therefore I'm okay. That I can make you feel good. But the other myth is I can make you feel bad. So if I try a little guilt trip on you, or maybe throw you under the bus or threaten you a little bit and you feel scared, I can make that happen in you in order to get what I want. So 2 myths, I can make you feel bad or I can make you feel good. But let's turn them backwards. There's also 2 myths that go the other way, which is you can make me feel good by rescuing me, by saving me, by telling me, whatever, or you can make me feel bad by threatening me, by questioning my intelligence, whatever.
This is one I had a hard time understanding when I was reading the book, because I think I can make others feel good or bad. I mean, I believe that. I believe that we have effects on each other. And I think it has to do with the word make is the problem. Why can't I make others feel good or bad?
This could become an argument because there are people that are really strong on both sides. I'll just share with you kind of my perspective about how I make sense of this and how I unpack it. There's a difference between affect and emotion. Affect is really a more primal kind of reflexive response that we have to the things that happen around us, to the physiological things, to threats, to whatever. Affect is experience, an increased heart rate, skin conductance, cortisol release, all of that stuff that goes on in our body. Then we have to interpret it and name it and identify what is this. That becomes emotion. So when I say I'm scared, I'm afraid, or I'm really embarrassed, or I'm feeling really defensive, I have given meaning, given a name to my physiology, to my affect. When I do that, I am already incorporating my own experiences, my own interpretations, my own values have now come to bear on how I choose to interpret that situation. A great example is, two people could have racing heart rate, and one person says, I'm scared that something bad's going to happen. The other one could say, I'm so excited to find out who won Powerball. Exact same physiology, two completely different emotions. That to me is evidence that our emotions are at least in part a result of our own stuff. So what that means then is my emotion may have been influenced in some indirect way by your behavior, absolutely. But my emotion belongs 100% to me. It is not yours. You didn't create it. You didn't put it there. I now am 100% responsible for what I do with it. And I think when we say, hey, you can actually make me upset, like, hey, I can't believe she really triggered me when she cut me off in traffic. Already by saying that, I'm giving myself permission to not be responsible for what I do next, because now my behavior probably was also caused by them.
That really helps a lot. I mean, this is one of the challenges of design of experience. So a lot of the show is talking about how do we design work that is going to make people, which is my sentence, feel whole and alive. And so then there's this question about how much control does the designer have on the experience of a design? And the answer is limited. They're not detached from each other, but the truth is that whatever experience I create for you is going to go through so many layers of interpretation by the most sophisticated interpreting machine on the planet that's so fast that what you do in the design of work maybe have completely different effects depending upon who is experiencing it.
I think there are some universal principles, though, that we can tap into around this. And I became really aware of this dynamic you're talking about when I got trained as an adventure course, ropes course facilitator and started facilitating team building activities. And the art of facilitating on a ropes course is you have these elements, whether it's a trust fall, whether it's a giant swing, whether it's everybody has to get over a wall together, whatever it is, it's a scenario that is intended to elicit and facilitate particular kinds of emotions, particular kinds of experiences. However, the whole point of it is we create a context that hopefully will elicit some opportunity, but then you have to make meaning of it. You have to actually own the experience and decide what you want to do with what's happening here. And so I think there is that interplay where we can be very intentional about that design, but there's also a dynamic.
Yes, we can be intentional about the design, which creates opportunity. And we might even be able to influence the frame of the interpreter by saying, not, this is a scary threat to your life, but this is an opportunity for you to experiment with fear, and then maybe reorient the nature of the experience.
Absolutely. This is a typical that scenario right there. Someone might be frozen on a pole, not able to jump. And we might then ask them, what's going on in your body right now? What are you telling yourself about what you're experiencing? Will you share your story? Are there any other ways that you could describe what's happening? And so really starting to emphasize, I am the creator of my interpretations of my meaning. We're here to support you. We're not going to tell you what it means to you, but you might discover a new meaning and make a new choice. And all of a sudden things change for you and we can celebrate that together.
I'll tell you why this is really important to the ongoing conversation on this show. Ages ago, can't be that long. The podcast's not that old, but seems like a long time ago. I interviewed Shalini Verma, and she and I realized that we had two different ideas about the responsibility of managers. My idea was, I'm going to try to design something that you want, basically, in the experience of work. And her thing was, I'm going to explore what triggers you in work. And when you are triggered, let's work together to find out why. So hers was basically placing the locus of control, like the locus of the event, in a different place. I'm placing it outside of you, and she's placing it inside of you as something that we might want to work on. And it makes me realize you're making me realize the power of that approach.
It's both. It's both. We are constantly being impacted interacting with the world around us, but we're also constantly choosing our narrative and reinforcing it or changing it. or interacting with that to decide how we want to remember it, how we want to talk about it, what kind of a story we want to tell, and who is there with us in those moments, as well as in the design of the context within which we find ourselves at work.
I want to point out something that became clear in your writing, which we might otherwise forget to mention. This idea of persecutor, victim, rescuer, it also is not necessarily baked into the hierarchy. The CEO can be self-victimizing, right? By circumstances. But it's also true that in a power structure, there's a little bit of an advantage for the more powerful to persecute.
Exactly. It's not intentionally baked into the structure, but it becomes part of the structure because one of the things we've noticed is in a typical organization, particularly more Western style of hierarchy, it's the persecutors at the top, the rescuers in the middle, and the victims at the bottom. Because the victims don't assert, they don't battle, they don't fight, and so therefore they miss out on things that normally that's how you get them in a traditional hierarchy. The rescuers get promoted until their level of incompetence because they're so capable. They're victims of the Peter principle, but they only can make it so far at that level. The persecutors are able to always win the fight, win the argument, win the battle, always have the upper hand because of how they construct their conversations, how they strategize, how they live their life, and even how their job descriptions are built. So it's unfortunate that that's the way it is. And what we found is those roles are actually highly predicted by personality structure. So there's a big overlap there with kind of how we become stewards of our personality, but how our personality also sets us up to have unique challenges within a hierarchy.
Let's dig into that a little bit. You know, something that comes up occasionally on the show is narcissism. Is narcissism at play in the persecutor role?
Oh, not necessarily. Narcissism as a clinical diagnosis, which I'm familiar with having been a clinical psychologist, is a pretty particular type of issue. But the way we kind of throw it around, is just kind of infatuation with myself. I can only see myself. I'm self-centered, kind of don't have a lot of empathy. There is a particular personality type who becomes very narcissistic, very antisocial, very kind of loses all empathy when they go into distress. They do play the persecutor role, but in a specific manipulative, conniving, kind of cold-hearted way. They're the ones most likely to be experienced as narcissistic and really completely immune to feedback, immune to holding a mirror up. They don't care. When you hold a mirror up to them, all they see is themselves and how awesome that is. But not all. There's other personality types that are not necessarily narcissistic. They become self-focused and maybe selfish, but not narcissistic.
I think we've done a good job of describing this dynamic that's going on, this self-reinforcing dynamic between the three corners that lead to drama. And before we actually start talking about how to interrupt that, everybody in this triangle is being fed. In other words, they are getting something that they want, which I don't really understand because being persecuted is unpleasant. But I'm being accurate, right? That there's actually something that everybody is getting out of this.
Yes, it goes back to what I believe is one of the most fundamental glitches of human beings. If you come from some faith traditions, you might call it original sin. If you come in from others, you might call it, there are brokenness, our fallen, whatever you want to call it. But here is a universal feature of human beings. In distress, we all seek to be justified. Self-justification is one of the most intoxicating experiences that a human can have. And you know it because of how good it feels to be able to say, see? We love to say it. We know we're not supposed to, but we can't help ourselves. And we can even do it in a tone of voice. We can say, which means I just got that jolt of justification that I was right, you were wrong. So that justification is the fuel. It is the modus operandi. It is the ultimate goal of the drama triangle. What are we getting justified about? Well, it's the myths. When we believe a myth, any belief that you have, you're trying to justify the belief. You want to prove it. So all of our behaviors seek to prove that the myth is true and achieve self-justification, which is why drama is so incredibly distracting and expensive in workplaces, because you can't be justified and effective at the same time.
One of the ways I understand what people want from work is I look at what they do in their spare time. people say that they want to solve puzzles. What do they do in their spare time? They solve puzzles. They're doing the crossword, they're doing whatever. People watch soap operas when they have enough free time. And I've never really thought about it before, but it may be that actually people come to work because whatever they get from soap operas, they get there.
Well, if all of my role models and all of my habits have been built around being in drama, that's what I know how to do. I'm good at it. I get what I want with it. I get the justification, even though it's painful and even though there's consequences. I know what's happening. I know how it works. So if I don't have an alternative skill set, if I don't know how else to do it, I don't know how to feel what it feels like to experience compassion, which is hopefully we'll get there. I only know how to feel self-justification. And so I just keep doing it. And I don't, in a way, it's hard to blame somebody for doing what has worked, what feels good at some deep level, even though it has damaging consequences.
How do we interrupt it?
We interrupt it by going back to the original definition of conflict. Conflict is a gap between what I want and what I'm experiencing. That gap, it contains immense energy. Whether it's an interpersonal gap or I am really troubled by what's happening with the climate and I want to change that, so I start a company. Eventually, it's all going to come down to how I interact with other people around accomplishing that goal. I don't have a conflict with the environment. I have a problem with the people that are responsible for fixing it or the people that are responsible for creating it. One or the other, that's where my problem is. So the gap is energy. I really believe conflict energy is probably the most plentiful energy source on the planet. And it is there for a reason. It's there for a purpose. It's part of the fact that we're different. However, that energy can be spent in drama. That's not conflict, that's drama. So conflict energy can be misused and misappropriated in drama in all the ways that we've just discussed. Or we can remind ourselves that we get to choose how we spend that. No one else is defining it for us. And this is, again, where we have to reject the myths. To say, wait, no, nobody can make me spend that energy in any way that I don't want to. So I have a different choice. That's the beginning of change. So then the question is, how else could I spend that energy to deal with this gap that I'm experiencing? And that's really been the purpose and the quest and the mission of Next Element, is to solve that question.
So interesting, because the first thing it seems like I'd have to do if I was making myself accountable for others, how others make me feel, right? Is I'd have to stop feeding myself the thing that's fed me for years. It's a hard thing to do, right? And so what are the actions we take to do that?
I really appreciate what you said. I'd have to stop believing these things about who made me. However, let's say that in a work situation, I was triggered by someone's behavior and all of a sudden I'm all upset and I'm acting like, I can't believe they made me mad. Why do they always do that all the time? Don't they know any better? I could stop and say, okay, who is responsible for my feelings? Well, me. Why? Let's unpack my own stuff. Who's responsible for their behavior? Well, they are. So I also have a choice to hold them accountable for their behavior, but not for my feelings. I have to hold myself accountable for my feelings, hold them accountable for their behavior. If I don't want it and if I don't like it, then I got to talk about it. So getting really crystal clear about what I'm responsible for, what I'm not, and what I want to deal with. So all of a sudden now we have three things. We have their behavior, we have my feelings, and we have a relationship dynamic where there's two parties involved now that somehow got to figure this out. And that creates kind of a three-part solution, which is there's what's going on with me personally, there's what's going on with their behavior, and there's the fact that there are two people here that are going to have to figure this out and decide what we're going to do about it. Then we have to come up with kind of ways to do that. And that's where compassion comes in.
How do you and your company, Next Element, engage with a company? What are the steps you go through to engage with a company to start to create the new patterns?
It starts with what we would call diagnostic. We have to understand, how is the culture currently designed? Because everything has a design, whether it's intentional or not. What are the systemic design issues that are promoting certain dynamics and behaviors? What is the health of the culture from the perspective of drama versus compassion? What's going on and how are people seeing things? That then really helps us have a good lens for where can we make the biggest impact? And at that point, then it's like, okay, let's raise awareness. Let's start to reframe the way we're seeing things. Let's see if we can have a different relationship with conflict and just open up the possibility. Maybe conflict isn't the problem here. Maybe it's the way we're dealing with it that's getting us into trouble. What if we had a different way to walk into those situations and it didn't have to turn out this way? And what if we had a template we could use? What if we had a guide? What if we had a way to construct that conversation where we're not winging it and we're not going off the rails and we know when to call time out instead of it just always going the way it's always gone? And that usually gives people hope. It's like, okay, well, then I might try it. So then we say, okay, let's take a look at a framework here. What if we replaced victim with openness? What if we replaced rescuing with resourcefulness? And what if we replaced persecuting with persistence? Because you can't take away someone's coping mechanism and not replace it with something else. Everybody knows that's tried to quit smoking or get out of an addictive relationship. You can't just go without the thing that gave you all of this dopamine. So when we say that, we're like, look, if you replaced victim with openness, what you would be doing is aspiring to your best, whole, valuable self instead of the part of you that's not worthy. If you replaced rescuing with resourcefulness, you would be tapping into that co-creative process where people come together to build a better future instead of having to fix it for each other. And if you replaced persecuting with persistence, you replace this attack and you honor that behind all those attacks are someone who's diligent, who's committed, who is not a quitter, who is going to see this thing all the way through to the end, but we're going to do it with each other instead of against each other. And people are like, wow, that sounds kind of hopeful. So teach me how to do that. That's when we start implementing specific strategies, frameworks, behavioral skills.
And what I heard you do, it was subtle, but I think I heard you do it, which you took something, let's say I'm the victim, you're the persecutor in this situation. We took something that where we were talking about our connection, because our connection was a persecution connection. You're not a persecutor, a persecutor. And we move it over to you and we say you're a persistent person. In other words, there's a way in which we're relocating from the interpersonal conflict and thinking about it as an attribute of you that's a positive attribute. It's almost like, why are you okay? You're okay because you're persistent.
You know, this first kind of crystallized for me when I was studying the process communication model, this personality science about where the myths came from. And one of the principles about human beings and personality is behind most negative attention is an unmet positive need. And so what if we looked at these drama roles as cries for help, as negative attention efforts, as masks that people wear? Then what we can look at them and we can say, wow, I don't need to get hooked by this. I don't need to take it personally. I don't need to play the game. What I can realize is behind that mask is a human being with some really important needs, some unbelievable gifts. And just like a car whose empty light comes on, we don't punish the empty light and get in a fight with the gauge. We go fill the tank. It's not personal. We don't cause problems with it. We just like, oh my gosh, tank's on empty. Let's go fill it up. So when we learn how to fill tanks, we can start inviting people to take off the mask and show us their true selves because we're feeding that part of the human. Again, that's compassion.
Can you describe an example where you have had an engagement and the steps, what was the diagnosis? Also, what methods do you use to diagnose? Do you sit and just watch? What do you do?
We start with more quantitative diagnosis. We have assessments, the culture assessment scans. We also have individual, we would call a drama resilience assessment, and we have also a personality pattern inventory. 3 assessments that we use to give us both a macro view of what's going on in the context, but also individual dynamics. So we have that. Also, all of our tools that we use are behavioral interaction tools. So this is about observing behavior to infer dynamics. So we're watching individual behaviors second by second all the time. Typical leadership team is going to have the dynamic of the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. And usually it manifests in the rescuer tends to overqualify, overjustify, overexplain, in a training consulting environment, they can't seem to ever get to asking their question. They just talk about all these things. They just go on and on and on explaining their thinking. Everyone else about falls asleep. And they look around the room and they interpret everybody's glazed eyes as, oh, I haven't explained it well enough yet. So they go on and on and on. And if that doesn't help, then they interpret it. Again, this is justification. Everyone is stupid because they don't understand what I'm saying. So they attack people for being lazy, unmotivated, stupid. How come I'm the only one that understands it? That is the thinker personality type going into distress. And they're adopting the persecutor mindset, which is, I'm okay because I understand it. I think right. I'm smart. I work hard. All of y'all are not okay because you're lazy, stupid, unmotivated, and you don't understand what's going on. And here's the thing is that behavior is a negative attention that's revealing an unmet positive need. That very person, what they really need is genuine recognition for their quality work, the productivity that they produce, and the value of their time. That is specifically unique. And when they don't get that in healthy ways, they take it out on everybody else by criticizing everybody else's work and time. So when we start to unpack that dynamic, what we realize is this thinker personality type found themselves in this position for two reasons. One is they did not take care of themselves. They didn't take personal responsibility for their time. They're overworking. They're not setting boundaries. They're taking on work. They're not delegating, which is their responsibility. That's why they're overworked, because they can't say no, which has its own reasons. But they also found themselves in there because of the group dynamic of how they're engaging with the other personalities in the room and in the organization and the culture that nobody talks about. So when we start to unpack that, we can start saying, wow, what if we all took personal responsibility for our own wellness and started caring about what other people actually needed? And to do that, we're going to have some conflict, because we're going to have to start saying no. We're going to have to start talking about behaviors. We're going to have to set boundaries. We're going to have to examine our procedures that allow this stuff to continue day after day.
Is compassion seeing beyond the behavior to the beliefs behind it or the needs behind it? Is that kind of the definition of compassion?
It is a function of compassion. We have a slightly different definition, but real compassion allows you to see the person behind the behavior, but it also allows you to talk about the behavior without making it personal. Two really important things about compassion accountability, but that's not really kind of what compassion, how we define it, but that is certainly something that you can see with someone who really gets it.
How would somebody who really gets it, how would you tell that they're acting that way?
They would have their switches on. And I talk about this in my book, Compassionate Accountability. There is a mindset of compassion, and we have to have the right mindset in terms of how are we going to choose to view ourselves and other people when this stuff's happening. And the compassion mindset is an attitude towards self and other that views people as valuable, capable, and responsible. Valuable, capable, responsible, all three, not one, not two, but all three. So the real question is, in this moment, with what's happening in the gap, how would I act if I and the other person or entity were valuable and capable and responsible? And then you can see the behavior that reinforces, affirms, and manifests those three things in how they talk. We have templates and we teach people how to do that, but that's what you would see.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's the recognition that everybody's doing their best. It's not that they're incapable, irresponsible, or not valuable in some way, like being stupid. It's that either I can't perceive it or something else is going on.
Here's a case in point. My wife, strong for a part of our marriage, the thinker part of her personality that I just described, very strong in her. She kept the calendars for the family when the kids were younger. She was on top of every activity. She ran the house logistically and was proud of it. She did a really good job. I was an entrepreneur, kind of winging it, flying by the seat of my pants. I'd come home from work and I'd be like, hey, what's going on tonight? And she would look at me and she would say, it's on the calendar. In other words, what is wrong with you? I work so hard and you're too lazy to even go look at the calendar. But what she's saying is, do you appreciate my work and my time and everything that I put into running this household? And by flippantly saying, hey, what do we got going on tonight? I'm blatantly disrespecting what fills her tank. So at that moment, when she says it's on the calendar, I could go into drama and say, well, maybe you could just point me out. I mean, why is it so hard to tell me what's wrong with, or I could say, Julie, you work so hard to keep everything going because of all of your attention to detail. All our kids get to their activities. And I could go over and look at that calendar, which is a master list for me. Fill the tank instead of going into drama. And by doing that, I'm owning that I'm responsible for my need to know what's going on. It's not her problem. And I'm also, if I care about her in a relationship, I'm going to give her what she needs instead of going into drama.
What I like about that story, there's a couple of different things. One is it's very easy to over-index on what people say to each other versus their actions. And it's partially because what they say to each other is more visible sometimes than their actions. But there is communication that happens in the actions. And the communication you could have done there is say, hey, I looked at the calendar today and I can see that tonight is this. Just looking at the calendar is the action that you could take.
Yeah. And there's also nonverbals. Every interaction has not just the words, but there's the tones, the gestures, the postures, and the facial expressions. She could have said, it's on the calendar, or she could have said, hey, it's on the calendar over there. One of them is absolutely not in distress and not condescending. The other one clearly conveys there's something wrong with you. So these are the nuances that we pay attention to in those interactions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, when I first started reading the book, I thought, I never see these behaviors. In other words, I thought I very rarely see them play out at work. Actually, they play out all the time. I can see them now. They just are a little bit subtler. They can be as quiet as what you just said, just a little bit of tone of voice. How do clients know they need your help? What's their experience that they're like, I needed some help here?
Well, I have a litmus test for a good model. Models are everywhere, right? We've been throwing around models, the drama triangle, the this, the that, the three switches. There's all these great models. I think models are really important because they give us frames, they give us language, they give us lenses, they give us ways to think about things. But to answer your question goes back to, I have a litmus test for a good model. Number one, you got to be able to write it on a bar napkin, draw it on a bar napkin in 30 seconds for obvious reasons. That's when you're going to need it most, right? Within 2 minutes, it has to tell my story to the point where somebody's saying, were you in my house yesterday? This is uncanny. This is really describing what's happening to me. In 5 minutes, it has to give people a hope for a new journey. Hope and efficacy, because people can be made aware of the problem and they can see the problem. But if they don't have hope that they can exert effort for a different narrative and a different outcome, there's no point investing. And I think that's where oftentimes we fall short. And so our models have to be unbelievably elegant and fast and simple, even if they're sophisticated and powerful. This is what happens with the drama triangle. I can describe it in 30 seconds on a bar napkin, and people are like, oh my God, that was my dinner table yesterday. That's every board meeting I've ever been in. That's my church. So then they're hooked. And then then it's like, hey, guess what? There's an alternative. It's called the compassion cycle. So instead of struggling against each other, we can struggle with each other to affirm our best selves and co-create with the energy of conflict instead of destroy our communities. And they're like, okay, let's do this. And there's a template. It's a 4-part thing where you can have a formula for how to have that next conversation that doesn't go off the rails. And they're like, I'm in. And so I think that's where the model is so important.
Yes. And they know they're in pain. They know that there's something wrong. They know that they don't like it, what's happening. We were talking about how it feels good, but it also feels bad.
Yeah. Well, Dart, people don't come to us because they want to change. They come because they want the pain to go away. And if we fall into that, if we accept that invitation, we are by definition now the rescuer because we're enabling symptom relief without lasting change and creating a dependence relationship that puts everybody at risk later. It's a consultant's way to get rich fast, but it's probably not the best long-term solution if we want to run a conscious business.
I have to admit that one of the experiences of participating, of being a participant in one of those triangles is saying, wait a sec, why did I just act that way? Right? Sort of noticing like, that was weird. Why did I rise to that bait versus other bait?
One of our advanced trainings is called Leading Out of Drama Intrapersonal. And it's a deep dive inside into how these triangles play, where they come from, and how do we start replacing those with compassion narratives, compassion self-statements, compassion beliefs, so that we can do the inside work, so that we can show up outside of drama on the outside. It's one of my favorite courses because it's just so rich, it's powerful. People discover things, but they also leave with this sense of, wow, I'm becoming a master of my own stuff for the first time. I'm realizing I do have choices. I'm not a victim of all of the things that people did to me, of all the things people tried to teach me. I'm not a victim of all these narratives. I can change things. And I think of Wayne Dyer's quote, famous quote, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And truly, that's what starts to happen when we rethink what conflict really is and how we can respond to it.
I also see this in larger groups. So like whole teams toward other whole teams, or whole countries toward other whole countries, where you start to see these patterns recur. So let's take a team. A part of the manager's role is to frame our perception of other parts of the organization. And this is one of the philosophies that I've really held to for a while, which is that emotions are contagious and that the emotions of a manager will absolutely translate to the whole team. And a part of a manager's job is to interpret the world in a way that, even no matter how they feel inside, to then create for the team a narrative in which it exists that is not rising to the bait, not vilifying other teams, for instance.
Yes. We see this dynamic at all those levels you talked about. We were working with a large hospital that was part of the HCA system. And this was a couple years ago when there was some pretty dramatic shifts in funding, legislation happening that really left the viability of the current business model pretty up in the air for this hospital. And we're working with the executive team and everybody's wringing their hands. Even the CEO, I don't know what's going to happen. I can't wait for the legislators to this. And, what happens if this? And everybody is just collectively in a victim mode. Like, we can't control everything. We're just a victim of this and that. We shared the drama triangle and we're moving. And finally, the CEO stood up and said, oh my gosh, we are so victims. We're focusing on all of these things that we can't control, and we're completely missing the things which we own, the things which we can control, the things which are within our domain. What if we started to worry about that stuff more? And it was really a fundamental shift in that organization to start just taking personal responsibility for our own existence within the things we can't control. They did some pretty amazing things in the next few years, and then that CEO went on to, was promoted to go run a whole region of HCA hospitals. But yeah, we see it all the time. Countries.
Yeah. Recently, there's been layoffs in the industry. I've had some talks with groups about their worries, their fears, their sense of betrayal when there's layoffs. And a part of what I said there is have some compassion, let's have some grace toward the challenges of leading a company of this size. In fact, you can see this inside companies, that these narratives start up. And the narratives sort of move from person to person, and they're kind of contagious throughout the organization. And one of the narratives is leadership is betraying us for selfish reasons. And a part of management's job, or a manager's job, is to introduce counter narratives. Because I don't think that's a healthy narrative. I don't think it's healthy for the people who hold it. And so introducing a counter narrative which says, let's have some grace toward the challenges of running a company of enormous size with a global footprint. And is that a reasonable approach? Does that make sense to you? Or can that be done better?
No, I thank you so much. I'm madly writing here because as you were talking, there was something I wanted to share with you. And as you continued, I got an idea for a blog. So I'm going to give you credit for this. What I'm about to share is, this is a really cool opportunity. What you've just opened up here is these narratives and counter narratives, and how the manager frames the narrative, and has a really challenging role, because the manager, like a team leader, their first team is the team of their peers. That's ultimately their first team, but they're leading a team that they're trying to integrate within the big narrative. So it's hard. There are three narratives of struggle that all end bad. And I think this is where managers can get into trouble if they participate in the narrative. The first narrative is that we struggle against, meaning everything is a battle. It's us against management. It's us against the world. It's win or lose. The pie only has so much in it. We can struggle against, meaning anytime there's a gap, we turn it into an adversarial narrative. But there's also another narrative, which is struggle instead of, which is, I'll cover for you. I got this. Here's what you need to do. I'll figure this out, which is the rescuer narrative, which is the manager saying, I'm buffering you from leadership. He's like, here's what y'all need to do. Just do this and you'll be fine. Trust me. I've been in this job. Nobody needs to worry. They're taking it for the team. And then there's a third narrative, which is struggle alone. How many of us are carrying burdens emotionally and we tell ourselves, nobody would understand. Nobody would care. They would judge me for it, or they have enough of their own burdens. I don't need to burden them with mine. So there's these three narratives. We struggle against anytime there's a problem. We struggle instead of every time there's a problem, or we struggle alone. Those match up with the three roles of the drama triangle. Every one of those is dysfunctional narratives, but there's a fourth narrative that you're just helping me put the pieces together, which is the narrative of compassion. The word compassion comes from the Latin root meaning with suffer. So the fourth narrative is when the going gets tough, we struggle together, not alone, not instead of, and not against. We struggle together. So if I could just finish your thought, you're like, so grace, what it means is for the teams to say, let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of these executives trying to make excruciating decisions with incredible consequences where nobody's going to be happy. As executives, let's put ourselves in the shoes of the people three roles down the rung on the ladder, having no idea how this is going to impact them. Left to their own devices, they're scared, they're anxious. So can we acknowledge that and listen to it and hear it, even if we don't have an immediate solution? So let's struggle together, realizing we're both struggling here in our own way. Let's come together around it.
Yeah. The first time I ever experienced a layoff, it was the .com bubble bursting. And I was at Cisco Systems. That was an annihilation of the tech industry. I forget what percentage of it, something like 20% of the tech industry was just out the door. And I was in a recruiting organization, and the recruiting organization was decimated in the real sense of the term. Because, of course, you get rid of the recruiters first. And so I was in a room managing data. I was pretty junior at the time, and I was managing data that needed to go to the SEC. So I felt like I was dismantling a bomb on an airplane that was diving toward the ground. It was a horrible experience. Well, the CEO, John Chambers, came to the room, and he looked terrible. It was clear that he had not slept for days. And John Chambers is a very honorable person. And he had said years ago, it was not a wise thing to say that Cisco Systems will never have layoffs. And he was having to eat those words. But the fact that he looked terrible was so refreshing to me. It was so heartening because what it meant was that the narrative of, the callous, money-driven leadership team that just wants their stock to go up is not right. And it really was an education to see that.
For him to show himself in that condition publicly was an incredible act of vulnerability, which is an incredible act of courage, which is one of the most important precursor or parts of compassion is become an equal as a human being. We all suffer. Showing your struggle and showing your suffering doesn't make you weak or less credible. It makes you relatable. It makes you human. It shows that you also are on this journey.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point.
Thanks for sharing that.
I do have a question that I ask at the end of every show, which is, what do you hire your work to do for you?
I was looking at your website, and it took me a few times to read through that statement to grasp what it is. It's a powerful question. I can really say that what I hire my work to do for me is to keep my 3 switches on every day. That human beings are valuable, human beings are capable, and human beings are responsible, which begs the question every single day. So what does that mean for your next choice? And as a leader, that's the kind of accountability I need. And so I would say every day that I keep this going, that I keep investing in this, it is so that that will happen. And our mission is to bring more compassion to every workplace, but it starts inside of each of us. And so that's what it does for me.
Your parents were missionaries, and you grew up in Africa? Which part of Africa?
My early years up until about age 9 was in Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then high school, I went in Botswana during the 1980s, during an apartheid regime in South Africa.
Do you feel that your philosophy around compassion may have emerged in any way from those experiences?
I'm certain that it did. I grew up in a situation where 2 things never fit for me. My parents were Mennonite missionaries, so I grew up in a pacifist, nonviolent kind of an upbringing where you never resort to violence, no matter what anybody does. And I grew up around a lot of violence and a lot of wrong. And so my question was always, so maybe I'm not going to respond, an eye for an eye. But how do we talk about the behavior? How do we change? How does anything ever get better if we don't change how we are with each other? How do we do this? And I saw lots of efforts that they just didn't seem to have the teeth and the results that I wanted. And so I think early on was planted in me seeds that I got to figure out a way to reconcile this. I'm going to gravitate towards people that seem to understand some angle of this or seem to have methods or tools that move us in that direction. And I would say that my father and my mother probably were, now that I look back, some of the most amazing examples of living in that tension and choosing a third way.
What does your job cost you?
It rarely costs me sleep. And I am so, so grateful for that. Probably the biggest thing it costs me is I feel like I am never off the clock from a behavior perspective. I never get to just feel justified. I never get to just follow my basic human instincts, even though I know it's not the right thing to do. And I got called on it the other day by a friend. I was not on the clock. I was not working, but I handled an interpersonal situation with a friend poorly. And he called me out on it. He said, Nate, you're better than that. And I realized it's like, yeah, I am better than that. I just didn't have the energy. I didn't want to. That's the hardest part of this job is just never get to, this is what we do for a living is we build these skills. So if I'm not doing them, if I'm not using them in every interaction, I feel like I'm letting myself down or letting my people down.
You've set an impossibly high standard for yourself in that.
Yeah.
And I think this is a perfect example of giving yourself some grace.
I'm so grateful for my wife. We go for walks and we let it all guard down. We can say whatever we want. Doesn't matter. Don't have to be using our tools. Those walks and my time in my hot tub is one of my best times to be able to have that grace. But thank you for that permission. It's important for me to give it to myself every day.
Where can people learn more about you, your work?
Yeah, we tried to make it really easy. Next-element.com is our website. Everything is there. We tried to make it really easy for you to get a flavor for who we are and what we do and how to reach us. But it's next-element.com.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. A great conversation.
Dart, you are welcome. It's been a joy and been a pleasure. Thank you for your presence, your intentionality, and for what you're doing.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.